Okay. Welcome again to Vetenskap och demokrati, Science and Democracy. In this module, we're going to talk about propaganda. And my goal is to first present what I take to be fairly standard definitions of propaganda, and then we'll discuss Jason Stanley, whose book was assigned in the reading, in comparison to that. All right, so when one is thinking about propaganda, to many people, the first thing that comes to mind are the sort of propaganda apparatuses of authoritarian regimes. Big posters of the leaders of China, Hitler's Minister of Propaganda, Joseph Goebbels, and his speeches drumming Germans to war, raising support for the extermination of the Jews, and the killings of political opponents, or the sort of portrayal of Joseph Stalin as the father of the Soviet Union, as you see it in that sort of poster. The focus of our module isn't so much trying to understand those forms of propaganda, although we will talk a little bit about that. But try to understand whether there's propaganda also in our societies, how it may work in ways that are not obvious to us, a little bit of why it works on us, and trying to get a bit clear on what exactly propaganda is and how it works. We won't focus so much on the mechanisms, the psychological mechanisms of propaganda, although that is an interesting topic in itself, and maybe we'll talk a little bit about it in our sessions. Okay, so let's get at some classical definitions of propaganda. So here are some dictionary definitions. The Oxford English Dictionary says, for example, that propaganda is information, especially of a biased or misleading nature, used to promote or publicize a particular political cause or point of view. The Store norske leksikon, similarly, propaganda er bevisst manipulering av folks følelser og tanker ved hjelp av sterke virkemidler for å fremme bestemte oppfatninger og handlingsmønstre. So here, on the one hand, you see that propaganda is information or contribution, as Stanley puts it, to the public discussion that's used to promote a particular political cause, or that's used to support particular ideas or particular actions. So that, of course, is in common with lots of political argumentation, but it does so, according to the dictionary definition, in ways that are biased or misleading, manipulating, or using some sort of emotions or strong kind of means. What exactly that means is a bit unclear. Okay, so that's the dictionary sort of idea. And that seems to fit some of the classic standard examples of propaganda. So on the Store norske leksikon website, you indeed find, for example, this sort of depiction of propaganda when the Germans occupied Norway. They put up a big sign on Stortinget saying that Germany is winning at all fronts. So they're trying to, this is biased information because it was not true at the time. Germany wasn't winning at all fronts. It's there on a very prominent side with a big V, I guess it was standing for victory, sign, and it was supposed to get the Norwegian public to support the German occupiers. Okay. Now, in this case, there's of course an insincerity. It's that the German authorities knew very well that Germany wasn't actually winning at all fronts. It was stuck in Russia, and later anyway, I don't know when the picture is shot, it was also then losing in France. Okay. So isn't all propaganda insincere? So all propaganda was kind of lying. Now you might suggest that it was manipulation might or bias might suggest that, but I believe that is not the case. Okay? Not all propaganda needs to be insincere. So arguably the Nazis, for example, really believed that Jews were evil and deceitful. Hitler, when he wrote propaganda speeches, or Goebbels, when he wrote propaganda speeches, may have actually believed that the Jews were as bad as he described them to be. So then he spoke, he was speaking, he wasn't lying, he wasn't insincere, he spoke what he believed was true, Goebbels did. So some of the very paradigmatic forms of propaganda are really not insincere. Now, and indeed, Stanley brings out that this is often important because paradigmatic uses of propaganda often use flawed ideologies. That is, they use belief systems that are systematically resistant to evidence, or that are systematically unjustified, where people, so in these systems, when people are subject to these ideologies, they hold deeply flawed beliefs, say, about the role of Jews in Germany. They're deeply wrong, but they really believe these things. And part of what we need to understand when we understand how propaganda works is to understand how people come to be in the grip of these ideologies that they really believe. So in that sense, it's important not to emphasize that propaganda is insincere, involves lying about something, because often it doesn't involve a lie. We need to understand how people can get in the grip of a flawed belief system, so that it doesn't, that the government need not lie about anything, because the people really believe that those who promote propaganda really believe it. We saw that also in the little bit in the when we talked about conspiracy theories, that a conspiracy theories, as Kassam suggested, is a form of propaganda. It tries to promote political cause, but it doesn't do that through insincerity. People are sincerely trying to find some truth. Now, is another question about propaganda, is it always intentional? So in the cases like of the Nazis with their victory promotions on the Stortinget, they probably were intending to drum up people for action to support the German occupation. In the Store Norske Lexikon, they talk about bevisst manipulering, so it suggests that they must be conscious that they're doing that. Now, it seems unlikely that everyone who is using propaganda is intending it to be propaganda. Most people are not going to think, oh, I'm going to drown these people into irrational action. They don't think that it's going to be irrational, for example. They might think it's rational. So in that sense, it's not obvious. But I do think in another sense, propaganda probably does need to have a goal. Okay? Propaganda can't be just happen. Those who are putting out propaganda, they need to have some goal, even if they maybe not completely conscious of that goal. So I'm a little bit unsure whether all propaganda needs to be intentional. I think that would be interesting to think a little bit about. Now, in the classic cases that that I've mentioned, the Chinese, the Soviet, or the Nazi governments, authoritarian propaganda, they often use false statements about, say, the deceitfulness of Jews, the Germans winning at all fronts, and Stalin protecting all the children in the country. These are not true. Now, is all propaganda false, though? Arguably, that's not the case. There arguably can be contributions to the discourse that get people to engage in certain acts that don't necessarily even have a truth value. Arguably, see that here, so we can do it to beat the Germans. So this is a propaganda posted by the British, actually. Yeah, I think that's a that isn't it. That's not something that necessarily is true or false. It just says let's do it. And arguably, but even when it implies some truth in that it's possible to do it, in that sense, well, arguably it was possible, and so in that sense it cannot be true. So arguably not all propaganda is false, and either because it doesn't have a truth value or because it is true. Okay. Now, another interesting question is whether all propaganda is bad. Now, the last example we saw is already suggests that may not always be the case. Arguably, if you want people to support a good cause, you may need to use propaganda, and maybe that isn't problematic. Maybe it's good to get people to engage in a cause that's worthwhile. Indeed, Jason Stanley thinks that sometimes propaganda is a necessary and important means in order to address an oppressive system. So he uses examples where, for example, you portray your oppressive, for example, your oppressed class, for ethnic group, an oppressed gender, and you kind of portray yourself or your own class in a way that sort of like plays on the problems that others perceive your people to have. And he thinks that's a kind of propaganda, but use it in order to address the problems in the system. So in that case, there is propaganda, but not bad. Yet still arguably, and I'm not quite sure what Stanley thinks about this, they might still think that all propaganda is problematic. And he says at some point that propaganda is invariably democratically problematic, though he says it's still necessary to fight oppression at some point. So I'm a bit unclear. So arguably you might think it is invariably democratically problematic because it undermines the public discourse that's necessary for people to deliberate together for the common good, which is arguably a requirement for democratic decision-making, it undermines that because it makes that public discourse irrational. Okay, so another interesting question, is all propaganda bad? I think there's a case we made that it is, because it is inherently a threat to democracy in the same way as conspiracy theories are, according to Kassam in the module that we had on that. So what he says about propaganda as conspiracy theories as a means of propaganda is actually maybe a feature of all propaganda, that it undermines that sort of public reason that is necessary for democratic decision making. Okay, now let's get to what Stanley calls the classical sense of propaganda. So this then involves, according to this definition, propaganda is a contribution to the public discourse. That can be an image, it can be a speech, it can be a video, it can be a film that manipulates. Okay, so what does it mean to manipulate? In a totally different context, when we speak about manipulation of, say, patients in a healthcare context to get them to do what we want, or someone manipulating a friend, the philosopher Nagel, so in the concept of bioethics, suggests that manipulation consists in adjusting the psychological levers. So I like that, sort of like someone playing with the screws in your mind, so that that your mind doesn't really work anymore in the way it's supposed to work. So you don't acquire, for example, beliefs in a rational way. You can't assess the evidence anymore. Maybe you form desires in an irrational way that's, for example, not consistent with what you want. So we can talk about practical rationality. So you somehow screw with people's minds when you manipulate, so that they can't make a rational decision anymore, both in the theoretical and in the practical sense of rationality. That manipulation need not necessarily be intentional. So we're going back to that intentional idea. So a manipulative friend, for example, it may be manipulating you by always kind of getting you to, in situations where you can't think rationally anymore, playing tricks on your mind, but they may not have realized that they're doing that. They may have been doing that sort of unconsciously. I think that's possible. So manipulation doesn't require be intentional, though it has a sort of goal, namely to get someone to think not rationally, or to want not to desire in an irrational way. Now, manipulating a friend it isn't a propaganda. So propaganda needs to address something like a large audience. Maybe it needs to address the public of a state. We'll get to that in a moment. And it needs to use that manipulation, according to this classical definition, in order to get the large audience to engage in a particular action, such as support the war, or support the leader, or join the army, or some such action. So it uses speech in a way not to give people reasons for to engage in various actions, but it changes them to think irrationally, so that then they will engage in a particular action. And the whole large audience will do that. It addresses the whole large audience, and not just a single person. Okay, that definition of propaganda doesn't seem to me to be particularly bad. So I think, for example, it's different from bullshit, which some of you may have heard about and talked about. Maybe you've heard or read Harry Frankfurt on bullshit, which also uses speech not to convey truth, but to just sort of to get some effect. But it doesn't necessarily want someone to get in particular action. So that is different from propaganda. This seems to fit some of the classic examples. So one piece of propaganda that I think illustrates propaganda very well is this film done by the Nazis, Jud Süß. And I think, I've seen it once with a friend who was working at the time on Nazi propaganda. And it's surprising how well it, on the one hand, it uses the sort of, it's from the 1930s, it uses the sort of classic Hollywood style of that time, but it uses that in order to portray the Jewish people, and there's a particular person in it, Süß, who is a kind of womanizer and who somehow tries to manipulate people. He's deceitful, he's dishonest. And of course, there's a lot of bad characters in movies, but it uses that very efficiently in order to somehow portray that underneath all Jews lies a deceitful character, and they're all kind of in this conspiracy together. So this involves manipulating the public so that they think irrationally. They know they have Jewish friends, but now they kind of think irrationally, and somehow they're going to feel underneath all of that is our Jewish conspirators. It manipulates all of them. It's portrayed, of course, in the movie theaters, so they think irrational and drums them to action, support for their Nazi, in the Holocaust. Or take this poster by Stalin. I mean, Stalin portrays himself as the supporter of all children in the nation, which is evidently false. It gets people to forget that children are dying of hunger and that there are millions of children dying of hunger. But it gets people to feel through the massive use of these images that somehow Stalin is there for them. Now, in this sense, though, a lot of advertisement would also count as propaganda, because it too displays something it manipulates people to think not very rationally about, for example, toothpastes, because they think that, well, some of them are a lot better than other toothpastes. By using means that they don't think rationally, because it portrays these beautiful images of toothpaste, and to make then a decision about what to buy. So it seems to fill, it was kind of manipulation. You don't think rationally about the decision anymore. It's addressed at large audiences. It's on TV. It aims to get audiences to engage them in a particular action. Okay. Now, is advertisement different from propaganda? It's an interesting question. How interesting is the difference between advertisement and propaganda? I think that's interesting. If I wanted to think about this: is propaganda something different from advertisement or not? Now, if one wanted to avoid the idea that advertisement counts as propaganda, I think one can try to do that. One can say, for example, that in the case of propaganda, the goals one has must be political goals rather than goals of making money. But then there can also be the political advertisement. So it can be advertisement for political programs and so on. So it's not completely clear that would be propaganda, but maybe it is. And maybe it involves something like manipulating the public discourse, where there's differences the way the public talks and thinks about things in public fora like a parliament, if there is one, or in the official institutions science, for example. So it's not obvious that, so that may be different from just changing how individuals, even though all of them make decisions, say about joining a war. Maybe that is just advertisement without change, if it doesn't change discourse about it. So anyway, that's an idea. So that's interesting to think about. I don't know what the answer is to that exactly. A slightly different conception that Stanley also talks about is the idea that propaganda is a form of biased speech. And he finds that, for example, in Noam Chomsky's work on manufacturing consent, which describes how in the US, sort of the United States engages in propaganda. And the difference, as far as I can see, is between this idea of propaganda as biased speech and the classical conception is that it doesn't drum people directly to action, but rather it gets them to do, to kind of forget that there are other options. So it gets them, for example, to think that there's only the Democrats and the Republicans, gets them forget that there's a large political spectrum that would also be alternatives that they don't ever even think about. So don't immediately relate to action, but the long-term effects will, of course, not be an action since some options are never considered. So it shrinks the space of things that you even consider as possible options that you might do. Okay, so these are the two forms of the two sort of classical definition of propaganda, the thing they call, that Stanley called the classical definition, and this idea of propaganda as biased speech. In the next part of the lecture, I'll then look at what Jason Stanley thinks about